There is a face carved into the sandstone at Karnak that does not belong in ancient Egypt. Not stylistically, not anatomically, not by any rule that governed royal art for 2,000 years before it appeared. A long, narrow skull, a jaw that hangs low and heavy, hips wide enough to belong to a woman heavy with child, a stomach that sags over the waistband of a kilt. For decades, Egyptologists stood in front of these colossal statues and didn't quite know what to say about them. Then, a little over a decade ago, a team of scientists in Cairo pulled DNA out of a shattered, nameless skeleton and used it to rebuild a face that history had spent 3 centuries trying to bury. What came back was not what anyone expected. This is the story of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tore down Egypt's gods, and the science that finally explained why his own body looked like nothing that had ever sat on the throne before him. Around 1353 BCE, a new pharaoh took the throne of Egypt under the name Amenhotep IV. For the first several years of his reign, nothing seemed unusual. He looked, in his earliest carvings, like every king before him. Broad shoulders, a strong jaw, the idealized athletic body that Egyptian art had used to depict royalty since the Old Kingdom. Then, somewhere around year 5, everything changed. He renamed himself Akhenaten, effective for the Aten, the sun disk he now declared to be the one true God. He ordered the temples of Ammonius, the most powerful religious institution in the ancient world, stripped of their wealth and shuttered. Thousands of priests lost their positions overnight. He erased his father's name and the name of Ammonius itself from monuments across the kingdom. Then he abandoned Thebes, the capital his family had ruled from for generations, and built an entirely new city from nothing in the desert 250 miles to the north. He called it Akhenaten, horizon of the Aten. Today, archaeologists know it as Amarna. This alone would make Akhenaten one of the strangest figures in ancient history. But the religious revolution wasn't even the part that unsettled people most. It was his face. Egyptian royal portraiture had followed the same rules for roughly 2,000 years. Pharaohs were shown as gods, perfectly muscled, perfectly proportioned, ageless. The point was never to show what a king actually looked like. It was to show what a king was supposed to represent. Akhenaten threw that rule book into the Nile. The art produced in his reign, now called the Amarna style, shows him with an elongated skull, drooping, heavy-lidded eyes, a protruding belly, thin, spindly limbs, and, most jarring of all, wide hips and what appear to be breasts. His wife, Nefertiti, and his daughters are rendered with the same odd, elongated proportions, as though the entire family shared some invisible trait passed down like a signature. Foreign officials who visited Akhenaten described a court unlike anything they'd encountered, and generations of later Egyptian scribes worked to make sure the whole episode was forgotten. Within a few years of Akhenaten's death, his city was abandoned, his monuments dismantled and reused as filler in other buildings, and his name struck from the official list of kings. Ancient Egyptian sources don't call him Akhenaten at all. They refer to him only as the enemy or that criminal of Akhenaten. For a long time, Egyptologists debated what the strange Amarna art actually meant. Some argued it was purely symbolic, a visual theology representing Akhenaten as a being who combined both male and female creative power, since the Aten was described in religious texts as father and mother to the world at once. Others thought it was simply a new artistic fashion imposed by royal decree, with no connection to how the king actually looked. And a smaller group of scholars floated something more direct, that Akhenaten's body actually looked like this, and that the art was closer to a medical record than a religious statement. For most of the 20th century, that last theory was treated as the fringe option. Then in 2010, a team led by Egyptian archaeologist Zahi Hawass and geneticist Yehia Gad decided to find out for certain. The project began with a badly damaged, unlabeled mummy that had puzzled archaeologists since it was first pulled from a side chamber of the Valley of the Kings in 1907. Catalogued simply as KV-55, the skeleton had been placed in a coffin whose golden face had been torn away and whose inscriptions identifying the owner had been deliberately chiseled out in antiquity. Someone a very long time ago had gone to considerable trouble to make sure nobody would ever know whose body this was. Hawas's team selected 11 royal mummies for genetic testing, including KV-55, an unidentified female mummy known only as the Younger Lady, and the most famous mummy in the world, Tutankhamun. Working from tooth and bone samples processed under strict chain-of-custody protocols, the researchers extracted mitochondrial DNA to trace maternal lineage, Y chromosome markers to trace paternal lineage, and a panel of autosomal markers fine enough to distinguish parents from siblings from cousins. The results were published in 2010 in the Journal of the American Medical Association, where any geneticist on Earth could scrutinize the methodology. What the data showed rewired the entire royal family tree. KV-55 and the Younger Lady were genetically full biological siblings, sharing both the same mother and the same father. And, together, they were the biological parents of Tutankhamun. Further comparison of the KV-55 skeleton's features, skull shape, jaw structure, and estimated age at death, combined with corroborating inscriptional and archaeological evidence, led the research team and many Egyptologists to conclude that KV-55 was most likely Akhenaten himself, or possibly a close relative sharing his precise anatomy. For the first time, scientists had a real skull to compare against the strange art of Amarna. With the skull data in hand, forensic reconstruction specialists could finally do something no one had dared attempt before: put flesh back onto the bones the priests had tried so hard to erase. The reconstruction confirmed an elongated cranium and an unusually shaped jaw, features that lined up with the exaggerated Amarna portraits far more closely than anyone had expected. It wasn't a perfect match to the most extreme temple carvings, which almost certainly still contained some degree of religious exaggeration. But the underlying skeletal geometry was real. The strange skull wasn't purely artistic invention. Someone in that family really did have a head shaped unlike anything Egyptian art had shown before. That finding reopened, rather than closed, the medical debate. Researchers have proposed a range of explanations over the years for the Amarna family's unusual features and for Tutankhamun's documented health problems, including Marfan syndrome, a form of craniosynostosis, a condition where skull sutures fuse early, forcing the skull to grow in an unusual shape, and various inherited disorders linked to consanguinity. No single diagnosis has one universal agreement among specialists, and some researchers still argue the exaggerated art was primarily symbolic. What the DNA study did settle, with much greater confidence, was the family relationships and the price the next generation would pay for them. Tutankhamun, the product of a union between two full siblings, became Pharaoh as a child and died around age 19. His golden burial mask is one of the most recognizable objects in the world, flawless, serene, symmetrical. His actual skeleton tells a very different story. CT scans of Tutankhamun's mummy, conducted as part of the same research project, revealed a foot with evidence of a bone disorder affecting blood supply, alongside a missing bone in one toe and mild scoliosis of the spine. More than 100 walking sticks were recovered from his tomb, far more than a purely ceremonial burial would typically require, and many showing genuine wear patterns from use. Genetic testing also detected DNA from multiple strains of the malaria parasite in his tissue, suggesting he had suffered repeated infections, with an active infection present at the time of his death. Researchers who worked on the case have suggested that a combination of inherited skeletal problems and infectious disease likely contributed to his early death, though, like much in Egyptology, the exact cause remains debated rather than definitively settled. None of this fits the young warrior king depicted riding into battle on the walls of his own tomb. The gap between the propaganda and the pathology is, by itself, one of the more striking findings to come out of Egyptian mummy research in the last century. None of this happened by chance. Sibling marriage among Egyptian royalty wasn't a scandal quietly tolerated. It was often deliberate practice, rooted in the belief that the pharaoh's bloodline carried something divine that ordinary Egyptian blood would dilute. Keeping the succession within the immediate family was, in the logic of the time, a way of protecting the kingdom, not endangering it. Modern geneticists can explain, in plain numbers, what that belief actually cost. Two unrelated parents have roughly a 2 to 3% chance of passing on a serious recessive genetic disorder to a child. Two full siblings share far more of their genetic material, and that shared risk of harmful recessive combinations rises dramatically. Commonly cited estimates put the risk of a major recessive disorder as high as 25% for children of sibling unions. Repeat that pattern across several generations of a family, as the 18th dynasty did, and the odds of inherited disease don't just rise, they compound. Akhenaten's unusual features, Tutankhamun's fragile skeleton, and the dynasty's inability to produce a surviving male heir after Tutankhamun's death are, in this light, less like separate mysteries and more like connected chapters in the same story. After Tutankhamun died without an heir, the throne passed first to Ai, an elderly court official with no strong hereditary claim, and then to Hormheb, a general with no royal blood at all. The family line that had ruled Egypt at the height of its imperial power ended within a generation of the boy in the golden mask. For 3,000 years, the strange statues at Amarna were treated as an artistic puzzle, a religious statement, or an embarrassment best forgotten. Modern genetics didn't just settle an argument about art history. It rewrote the biography of one of the most famous burials in the world and reframed a beloved chapter of Egyptian history as a case study in the biological limits of dynastic ambition. The face on the temple wall wasn't propaganda, and it wasn't fantasy. It was closer to a record, an accidental, unintentional confession carved in stone by artists who had simply been told, for once, to draw the king exactly as he was. 3,000 years later, a DNA sequencer in a Cairo laboratory finally read that confession for what it was.